Hello and welcome guys to another video. So today we have another hot lap and track guide, and again we have both a wet and a dry track guide. So we're going to have a look at the dry hot lap first, then the guide, and then we'll have a look at the wet hot lap and track guide. So now that we've had a look at the hot lap, let's have a look at the guide. So for the first corner, we're looking for this board on the left hand side with the right turn signal on it. And just as we pass that, we want to get onto the brakes. Down into third gear, and we want to turn in quite late for this corner, but there is a bit of the camber, so we're kind of aiming for this little dip here. We want to hook the front right into that dip. But we get on the power really early. As you see, we're off the brakes just before the end of this barrier disappears. And then we're onto the power. So we're actually getting onto the power just before we get to that apex curb. And then try and unwind the steering wheel nice and early to use all this exit. There's some concrete underneath this grass, so you can use this to open up the exit of the corner. And now going down the hill, we're looking to keep the car as stable as possible and brake in as straight a line as possible. So we want to be over to the right as we come over this blind crest. And now we want to get onto the brakes just before we get to the end of this barrier. So there's a marker at the end of this barrier. Just before we get to that, we can get on the brakes, or you can use this curb as a reference. After that, we get onto the brakes, like a car length or two. But I would say that probably the easiest reference to use is just before you get to this barrier on the right hand side. We want to get onto the brakes just before that disappears. And now this is very bumpy. You'll see the car go up and down and up and down. So you just want to be as smooth as possible with your braking input, trailing off the brakes down into third gear. And we want to apex this corner again really late, but we want to try and sort of follow the corner rather than going out wide and then bringing it back in. We want to try and get that front left close to the curb nice and early to take advantage of this camber. And then we're getting on the power just before we get to this flat section of curbing. So you can see that there's two separate types of curbing. We've got this type, and then we've got this type, and then we go back to the same as this. So just before we get to this flat curbing is then when we get back onto the power, and then we want to unwind the steering wheel and use this exit. Now, this can be a bit tricky on track limits, so just be careful not to go too wide here and invalidate your lap, but you do want to make sure you take advantage of that exit curbing. And now coming up for this high-speed left-hander, this can be very sketchy, especially in a race. But what we can use as a reference here is on the right-hand side, there's this escape road. And as we pass that, we want to come off the power, go into fourth gear and just use a little bit of braking. So come off the power as we get to the start of that escape road. Just a little bit of braking, like 20%, just to get it turned in and just stay off the power. Let it coast around the corner. Just use a little bit of the braking as you need to. And you want to make sure that we're getting a later apex here because we want to exit to the left. You will see why in a second. So as you see, just coasting off the power and then starting to get on the power once we know the car is gripped, and still keeping the wheel left because we want to bring it over to the left to open up this upcoming hairpin. And now again, this is a really cambered hairpin, so we want to make sure we get into the apex, and we're looking for the end of this tire wall as our braking reference. So as we pass that, we want to get onto the brakes, down into third gear and then second gear, and we want to basically just follow this corner around. So as this curb begins to start, we want to get nice and close to it and then take advantage of this curbing, trailing the brakes really deep into the corner, and then as we get around about halfway around the hairpin, then we get onto the power, still staying in that camber, then unwinding the steering wheel and opening up the exit of the corner. And now we go into the chicane, which can be a little bit tricky because of these tire walls, which if you hit them are just solid concrete apparently, and do not behave like a tire wall would. Before the chicane, the most crucial point is the exit, so you can take it a bit cautious on the entry, but the main focus is to get on the power as early as possible. And now for the entry, there isn't really a good braking reference. This is where Luciano starts to brake for the chicane. Now, as you can see, there isn't really a very good reference. What you can use is there's a little triangle of gravel here. You'll notice that there's a triangle here, and then there's a triangle here of gravel, like a triangle shape. And you can use this first one as kind of a reference. It's a bit difficult to see, but if you can pick that out, then you can use that as a reference, that sort of first triangle. You're getting onto the brakes, and then you're basically aiming to get the front left as close to this tire wall as possible. Quite an early turn in, because we want to get into second gear and basically straight line this first curb. As you see, still on the brakes as we go over the curb, and then a little bit of steering input just to keep the car stable. And then as the car stabilizes, then we want to immediately start turning in for the right, trailing off the brakes now because we want to start opening up the exit. So we're trailing off the brakes, and then just before we get to this tire wall, as you see the exit is completely covered by it, we want to then be getting onto the power so that we can get a good exit, because we want to use a little bit of this curbing. But you'll see as we come up here, we've got a left-hander, just try and open up the wheels as early as possible, but we've got this little hill. So that's why the exit of that chicane is so vital, because if you compromise the entry to get a better exit, you'll gain it back on the exit. Whereas if you just try and take as much speed as possible into it, you'll lose it on the exit of the corner. So now for the second chicane, this is quite a technical section of corners coming up. So we're looking for the 100-meter board. Just before we get to the 100-meter board, we're down onto the brakes. And now we want to turn in just around about the third cone on the left-hand side. The third cone on the right-hand side. As we get to this cone here, that's where we begin to turn into the car. And we're basically aiming for the right tire to be as close to this tire wall again, just like the last chicane, but we want to exit to the middle or to the right of the track to open up this upcoming left-hander. So getting onto the power just as we reach the apex, and then lifting off the power, just a tiny 10% braking just to turn it in for the left-hander, turning in quite early, but again just getting as close to that tire wall as possible, and then unwind the steering wheel, get onto the power. But then we want to bring it back over to the left. As you see, Luciano gets a little bit of a slide there, which actually allows him to open up this upcoming right-hander a little bit better. But just be careful with that. And then all you need to do is lift off the power just to get the nose turned in. And we're aiming to get that front right onto this red and white curbing and get on the power just before we get there. And then again, we're going up a hill, so we want to unwind the steering wheel and focus on that exit. And now coming up the hill, we've got this left-hander. Just keep it nice and tight to the left of the track. And again, for this right-hander, we want to turn in around about this escape road on the right and then bring it over to the left of the track. Because we've got this double right-hander coming up, we want to be here to open up this coming right-hander. So for braking, what we can use is basically we've got this curbing on the left. And just after we get past that, soon as we straighten the wheel after that curb, we want to get on the brakes. There isn't really a reference. You might be able to use this tree before we get to this tree about car length, but personally I find that red and white curbing, soon as we get past that, soon as the wheel's straight, we brake. So we want to brake. This is a double apex right-hander, so we're braking fourth gear, quite a bit of pressure, about 60%, down into third gear, and we're turning in before we get to this change of tarmac line, and we're aiming to hit the first apex here. So we turn in, we get that first apex here on this curbing, and then what we're going to do is we're going to let it drift out to around about here to the middle of the track, let it drift out a little bit, and then we're going to bring it back in, and we're going to try and hook up the middle apex around about here. Clip that second apex, and then unwind the steering wheel and open up the exit of the corner. And now going into the final corner, this is actually really easy to spin with the height changes, not height changes, elevation changes. It's very easy to spin in the last corner, so just be careful. So going into the last corner, we want to brake just after we pass this right-hand turn signal board on the left-hand side. And then we're trying to turn in as late as possible down into second gear, and we're basically turning in to apex at this escape road on the right hand side. So quite a late turn in, apex at that escape road, and then unwind the steering wheel. The exit's actually blind. You just want to unwind the steering wheel as soon as you hit that apex, and then drive over to the exit curbing. A little bit of a slide there, but you can just correct it using that curb, and then get on the power up the hill, and then the lap is complete. So now let's have a look at the wet hot lap and track guide. So let's have a look at the guide. Now that we've seen the hot lap, we'll notice that a lot of the corners, because they're so cambered, the water goes to the inside, so we need to go on the high side to avoid the puddles. So the camber is actually really helpful because unlike street circuits like Adelaide, which are really flat, where it just floods most of the track, a circuit like this, we can basically just go to the high side of the camber and avoid the puddles. So let's have a look into the first corner. So a very similar braking point for turn one as we would in the dry. We're using this red right turn signal on the left hand side to brake, but instead of braking on the left side of the circuit, we're slightly more to the middle. So we're braking down into second gear, and we're basically aiming to end up over here where this dry patch is. So braking down into second gear, and then instead of trying to aim for here, we're aiming to get over to this dry patch. So as we see here, the apex is still this point here, but instead of it being here, it's going to be more like here. And as we see, that allows us to then exit onto the dry patch. That's going to stop the traction control kicking in as much. Now we can use a little bit of those curbing, but every time you use the curb, the traction control will kick in. So we don't want to use too much. They're more of just if we go a little bit too far wide, then we can use them, but I wouldn't be trying to use them on the exit. Now coming down the hill, this is also a really another really cambered corner. So we're looking to try and brake as straight as possible. As we come over the hill, we're going to get on the brakes just after that red and white curbing disappears on our right hand side. We're going to start lifting off the throttle and then getting on the brakes, and we're trying to brake on this dry patch here. So we've got this really nice dry patch, and we're going to brake down into third gear. We're going to get nice and close to the start of this curbing, and then we're going to let it drift out wide so that we can take advantage of this dry patch over here, because our usual apex is flooded. So let it drift out wide, and then as we come off the brakes, we're then trying to turn it in for a second apex. So see the change of the two curbing from the flat curbing to the bumpy curbing. We want to use that as kind of the second part of the corner, the second apex reference. Then we want to get on the power, again staying on this dry patch, avoiding the exit because that's flooded. But as you see, it's a bit of a funny line, but that just is what works when it's so flooded. And now coming for this high speed left-hander, this is very tricky with the amount of water. So for the braking reference, we're looking to our right side and this escape road. So in the dry, we use this one over here. In the wet, we use the one before it. As we pass that, we come off of the power and onto the brakes down to about 30% braking. And instead of trying to apex here, we want to be slightly more to the middle of the track. Follow it round, down into third gear, and using this dry patch on the right hand side. We don't need to bring it all the way over to the left on the exit. We just want to try and use this dry line on the outside. Getting onto the power, and now we want to aim to bring it over to the middle. So rather than being over to the left like we would in the dry, we want to be over to the middle. And then we're braking just after the tire wall on the left. So just after that, we get onto the brakes, and then we're aiming to apex around about here, but then let it drift up. So we'll see this here. So as you see, we want to bring it in for the first apex as this curb starts. So we want to bring it into that apex, and then instead of trying to stay in this flooded section, we want to let it drift out to the middle of the track. In second gear, let it drift out, and then just after halfway around the corner, then we get onto the power and making sure that we're on this dry patch on the high side of the corner. Get on the power, unwind the steering wheel, try not to use the exit curb, and now we head into the chicane. Now this chicane is sketchy in the dry, so in the wet it's even worse. Now for the braking reference, there isn't really one. We can use again what we said in the dry with this like triangle of gravel. There's two triangles around about here where this first one starts. We want to get on the brakes, and we're aiming to be on the left rather than the right. So instead of opening up this corner like we would on the dry, we're trying to brake here because it's nice and dry. And then basically just like the dry, we want to take as much curb on this left side as possible. Even though it's wet, we want to use as much as possible. But instead of aiming to go here, we want to aim just more to the left than we would in the dry. And then as soon as we straighten the wheel, we immediately turn in for the right again. Not as close as we would be in the dry. We want to be slightly wider just to take advantage of this drier patch on the exit. So the left side's a bit drier. Unwind the steering wheel. We can use a little bit of this curbing on the left, and then unwind the steering wheel again and avoid that curb on the right hand side. And now going into the second chicane, we want to brake again on the right hand side, and we're looking for the 100-meter board, and we are braking just before we get to this 100-meter board, but instead of braking here, we're braking on the right side of the track. Braking down the gears, down into second gear, and we want to make sure that our initial braking pressure is on the right side or the middle of the track away from the puddles. But as we approach the corner and we're coming off the brakes, we can then go into the flooded part of the track, as we see here, just to open up the corner. Not going all the way to the left, but slightly to the left from the middle. And just like the dry, we want to apex at this tire wall on the inside. And then for the left-hander, all we need to do is just lift off the power, tiny touch of the brakes, 10%. And again, we want to apex at the tire wall on the left-hand side. And keep it to the left, then unwind the steering wheel. And now we're pointing for this dry patch. We want to use this dry patch. And then as we get to that dry patch, we want to lift off the power, a little bit of braking, and then just take a really wide line around this right-hander. The inside's flooded, so just take a wide line and we can use that dryer patch. As we see, still fighting the car a little bit. Going up this hill on the left, just trying to take advantage of the dryer patches. Now coming up for the double right-hander, we want to use this escape road just like we did in the dry as a reference to turn in for the left-hander. But instead of taking it full throttle, we lift off as we get to that escape road, and then we unwind the steering wheel and get on the power, and we're aiming for this dry patch. So for the double right-hander, we're going to take a bit of a different line, and we're going to brake just after the curb on the left-hand side. So just after we get past this curbing, we want to straighten the wheel and then get onto the brakes. Braking down into third gear, and then just trying to follow this dry line, opening up the entry a little bit, and then turn in for this first apex. And then what we're going to do is let the car drift out over to here because it's drier. Instead of keeping it here like we would in the dry, in the wet we want to let it drift out a bit wider, still on the braking, and we're letting it go all the way up to the white line, and then getting on the power. And instead of aiming for here, we're aiming for the middle. So getting on the power, bringing it over to the middle of the track, and then unwinding the steering wheel and getting onto the power. A little bit of a slide on the exit, just try and avoid that curb because all that's going to do is get the traction control to kick in. And now for the final corner, we're braking on the right side of the circuit because the left side is flooded as usual. And we were braking just after the turn marker on the left hand side. So just after we pass that, we're then getting onto the brakes, dropping down gears, just staying on the right hand side. And then as we approach the corner, we can bring it a bit over to the middle of the circuit and turning in as we get to the start of the apex here. But instead of bringing it all the way over to the escape road, we're trying to keep it sort of in the middle of the track and then get on the power just after we pass that escape road on the right hand side, and then unwind the steering wheel and use all of the track on the exit. Just try and not use the curb on the left because that's just going to unsettle us. And then that is us to finish the lap in the wet. So as always guys, thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed and see you again next time.